Welcome back to Perfect Takes. I'm your host, Stephen Patton, joined as always by my co host and dear friend, Jake LaQuire. And today we get to discuss the end of Nothing Ever Happens fan club because something, and not just one something, multiple somethings happened yesterday that I don't think a lot of Panthers Nation expected to actually happen. I think there was hope that it would kind of snowball into what the opening tampering period would look like. But is this how you honestly thought Monday would look like, or did this kind of exceed expectations?
Well, from a Panthers perspective, these are actually the two main guys we signed because we signed three exterior free agents. The two main guys we signed, I actually thought we would get. The price tags were a little bit different, but free agency as a whole, I think got thrown for a loop when at 12:01 p.m. free agency opens at noon on Monday. Um, Alec Pierce, the Colts receiver, not only returned to Indianapolis but signed a deal worth 29, I think just a little over 29 million per year, something that I think is exorbitant. The amount that he got. This is a guy that's never caught 50 passes in a season, and yet he still had over 1,000 yards last year. The Colts then traded away Michael Pittman to Pittsburgh for I think a sixth rounder or something like that. That was a huge signing to start, and then from there, the deals just started rolling in, and so it was interesting from there. When you see that a receiver that's maybe what would you say the 20th to 25th best receiver gets 29 million per year, you know people are going to be expensive, and that fell right in line with when the Panthers got their first free agent signing, edge rusher Jalen Phillips from the Philadelphia Eagles.
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I was a little blown away by how much we handed a guy who has struggled to stay on the field over kind of the past few seasons. You shell out a contract, $120 million over 4 years, 80 million's like pretty much fully guaranteed. So his base, and it's not the correct contract terminology, but kind of like the threshold at which like you're looking at like what you're paying a year is pretty much 20 million and it could be upwards to 30 million. And I think if he stays on the field and he's healthy, this is a player worth around 25 plus $1 million a year. I think he's definitely shown that up to this point in his career. It's just the injuries have a big hesitation for me. And the reason why I say that is because you look at guys that we've paid over the past couple off seasons and why they are not to this caliber of player. You see DJ Wanham, he was supposed to have a big impact a couple seasons ago. He spent most of the year dealing with a heart issue. Patrick Jones last year gets hurt very early into the season, and he's not a contributing factor for us. And so these players that were supposed to have a starting impact on the team couldn't find the field. And with our turf field at Bank of America, it just has me a little bit concerned on that front. Do I think that was a guy we should have gone after? Absolutely. It's between Jalen Phillips and Adofe Owe, who ended up signing with the Washington Commanders for about $25 million a year. So this was definitely the market. For anybody that's interested in kind of the inflated value of Brian Burns' deal that he signed with the New York Giants a couple of seasons ago, Brian Burns' deal, if he were to sign the same contract, would be around 33 million this offseason. So I guess the best way to look at it, if you're trying to see it as the glass is half full, is that you save $3 million, you got a younger player, and you also got a second round pick that you were able to snowball into Jonathan Brooks and I believe Nick Scorton. So I at the end of the day, like I'm happy with the direction this franchise is going. Again, the hesitation goes back with Jalen Phillips' health.
For sure. It's definitely a concern, especially when he had two early injuries. But you look at his age, right? He's going to be 26 this year. You would imagine that he's coasting into his prime right about now. I think he's a year younger, excuse me, than Brian Burns was. And you mentioned the market, right? With Owe going to the Commanders at 25 million. I think Phillips, I wouldn't say he's a full tier above Owe, but I think he's less dependent upon the scheme he was in because you got to take a look at where Owe was playing last year with the Chargers. Jesse Mentor was one of the best play callers in football last year. He was the successor to John Harbaugh and the Ravens. Like that's how good of a defensive mind he is. And so I wonder if there's going to be any fall off there. Whereas Phillips played in a Vic Fangio system his rookie year or his early years in Miami. He played for Vic Fangio's system last year in Philadelphia. And now he goes to one of Vic Fangio's key disciples in a Giro Avero. So I think there's going to be very little fall off there as far as his role goes this season, but certainly a lot of money on the surface. It was more than I expected, but think back to last year when the Panthers had the, we'll say, the top paid free agent, quote unquote, in the bag in Milton Williams, and then the Patriots upped the offer and stole him away from the Panthers. They weren't going to let that happen again, right? 2 years in a row, that would just be not only embarrassing for the team, like the perception of the team, but to miss out on two key contributors, excuse me, back to back would have just been destructive. The Panthers weren't going to let that happen, and so if you imagine the Eagles were offering something like 27 million, 28 million, upping it to 30, I think is what got it done and brought Jalen Phillips, who finally is a competent pass rusher. We're not shopping from the bargain bin anymore. Dan Morgan gets his guy, and the Panthers said afterwards that they thought that, or this is coming from the like the insider people, a direct quote from the team, that they believe Phillips was the best free agent in general out of everybody in this year's class, and it shows because they gave him the highest deal. Alec Pierce is just underneath it, but Phillips has the highest deal so far.
Yeah, and Ricky Scoops, I like your point about talking about like the Philadelphia Eagles. There was an offer on the table. Ricky Scoops, or Ricky the Dog, as most people know him on Twitter, a guy that has definitely insider source and ability to kind of hear storylines that are going on behind the scene. This was a guy that he thought was going to get retained in Philadelphia. He wasn't going to hit the open market, and so kind of what the Patriots did with us, and they were able to steal Milton Williams last offseason. We were able to do that with the Eagles and able to convince Jalen Phillips and his agent to come to Carolina. And that's great. Like, you're going to have to sometimes overpay to get some of these guys. And the fact that we didn't have to overpay to the extent of like a Tyler Linderbaum situation with like the Las
Yeah,
Vegas Raiders is huge, because that was probably the biggest overpay yesterday that we saw. Now, a guy that when we talked about last episode about like kind of market value, market range, and market value probably should have been 16 to 18 million when you look at like I guess other linebackers signed in his range. Devin Lloyd, we got for I guess you would say a bargain, or at least market rate, at getting $15 million a year over 3 years. And really the guarantees are a little bit lower than some of the guys that were making kind of the money he was on previous contracts, guys like Nick Bolton or Jermaine Sherwood. So when you look at that, you look at his kind of status in the NFL. I think he's a little bit more proven with having a second team All Pro last year and having a really good season. Is that if he can continue to build upon that, especially playing with the defensive line we built over the past couple off seasons, he could continue to grow and look just as good as he did last year. And I think that's the goal with bringing him in from Jacksonville. And it's interesting. I think the NFL Fashion Advice account kind of tweeted out how the Jaguars and the Panthers being the two 1995 teams or franchises. The fact that he went from the Jaguars to the Panthers and keeping with that mantra is really cool to see.
yeah, the two expansion teams, right? The 1995 Big Cat teams, both of who went to the conference championship, right, in year two. It's been a little bit different since then. Obviously, we've been to a couple of Super Bowls, and Jacksonville has not. But both teams made the playoffs last year. The Eagles also, with Jalen Phillips, made the playoffs last year. And I think when you look at getting the best edge rusher, some people might think Trey Hendrickson, but he's a little up there in age. Certainly the best linebacker in free agency. These were the two positions Dan Morgan, the general manager, talked about at the combine, saying we were going to attack. Well, we attacked them. We got the two guys that I think everybody wanted. There was apparently a bidding war for Devin Lloyd late into the night last night before he signed with the Panthers. And if you had told me last week when we were doing the preview that we would get the two top players or the top players at their positions combined for 45 million a year, I would have thought, okay, maybe Phillips for 25 and Lloyd for 20, but it ends up being 30 and 15 relative. So I'm cool with the combined value. When you look at it in that way, maybe it's a bargain for Lloyd, maybe it's a bit of an overpay for Phillips, but these were two positions that the Panthers really needed. Uh, we talked about linebackers last week. The story of this franchise is linebackers, and that story has been lacking. for the past, what would you say, 5-ish years, ever since Luke retired in 2020. So going on 6 seasons now. We needed a linebacker. Lloyd was an All Pro last year, and hopefully getting both of these guys together, plus the D line we have, plus some of the young guys like Nick Squirton, Princely, Umam Yellen, they can all ascend together. And that's not to mention guys like J.C. Horn, Mike Jackson, and Trayvon Merrick on the back end of the defense. Is it too early to say that this could be a top 10 defense? Because I think that there's the talent at every level is there. It's just about the scheme and it all coming together.
The scheme at this point, Evero has no excuses from that
Hmm.
standpoint. You have the players in place, but I think it really does come down to, do guys stay healthy? Because I think on paper this is a unit. If they can kind of put it all together on the field, which is definitely possible, the potential to be a top 10, top 12 unit is there. I My concern would be, okay, what does it look like from a depth or rotation standpoint on the defensive line? Do we see a step from Trevin Wallace? Are we able to retain a guy like Christian Roseboom to be a special teams and maybe situational blitzer on certain downs where a defense or offense goes kind of heavier with their personnel sets? So it's going to be very interesting to kind of see what we do on that aspect. From a depth standpoint, we also signed yesterday Kenny Pickett to a 1 year, up to $7.5 million deal. So we've seen Bryce Young miss a couple games. It's good to have a veteran in the league to kind of be able to step in those circumstances. We signed Isaiah Simmons, who is that like linebacker safety hybrid, who's also going to be playing more of a special teams role. And a couple other guys include Labron Ray, Caleb Evans, Robert Rochelle, David Moore, uh, Mr. Dave Canales' favorite, I guess, wide receiver, you could say, and then Thomas Incoom. So you see the lining for kind of that depth is being set, and it's just retaining guys that we've had there. And if they can simply be the role players, the guys that are depth pieces, that is going to help this defensive unit become top 10, top 12. If they have to come in and play like a major contributing role, or they have to be a starter for an extended period of time, that's when you're going to see this unit start to dip, because those aren't players you want to see on the field for these long durations of period.
Everybody you
Or
mentioned there are special teamers as well. So keeping your like I would say your core special teamers, guys that play your core four, so both returns and then punts and kickoffs. Those are your core four special teams units. Getting all those guys back who are in the system familiar, I think it's just good business. They're also cheap relatively, right? You're not spending 8 million a year on a special teamer, right? These are guys that are making below 2 million a year, so good business there. You mentioned Kenny Pickett. I know fans aren't excited to hear that name, given how he's we can call him a bust now as a first round pick, but he's a lot better of I'll say this: he's a better backup than Andy Dalton. If you think that, or if you still believe that Andy Dalton has any role on this team or is the real quarterback on this team, I am begging you to go watch the Buffalo Bills game on NFLPlus.com. You can watch the replay. That was some of the worst quarterbacking I've seen in quite some time. So the benefit of Kenny Pickett is he's younger. He probably won't make as many mistakes as Dalton did in that game. And if you recall the first turnover Dalton had in that one, he was trying to scramble on a third down, and then he just lost the ball out of his hands on a fumble. Kenny Pickett has small hands, but he is mobile, so you're not going to see a lot of that if he has to step on the field. And because we're playing in the Hall of Fame game, we might get some Kenny Pickett to maybe Xavier Leggett fireworks there in the preseason. So that could be a big part of that signing. But those are the people we've signed so far and the people we've retained. We also cut Ashawn Robinson. That was somebody we talked about could get cut to free up. I think it was 10.5 million in cap savings for some of the guys we had to sign with Jalen Phillips and Devin Lloyd. There's going to have to be some cap saving movement. I would expect some restructures to be announced tomorrow as well, because you can I think you can get away with not doing anything until the league new year officially opens tomorrow, Wednesday at 4 p.m. So I would expect like J.C. Horn, Derek Brown, maybe Robert Hunt to have restructured deals. But yeah, that's been the movement so far. What are we at? 29 hours, something like that, 30 hours into free agency, and we've signed three outside free agents. Two are obviously big tickets. Uh, I don't know. What's your review been on it so far? Like, if you could grade it so far, what would you give the Panthers?
Again, you don't build through free agency. Obviously, the past three free agency classes have been instrumental. You look back a couple years, the Robert Hunt, Damian Lewis signings; those were big on offense and helping us evaluate Bryce Young in the offense. And then last year, just seeing your ability to retain a guy like J.C. Horn was huge. Finding a guy like Mike Jackson, I think that was actually no, that was a trade that we had, and then we extended him. But just some of those pieces that you saw, defensive line additions and like Bobby Brown, and obviously Patrick Jones doesn't work out, but you see some of these pieces that kind of like fall into place and they're key contributors, and that's what you want, like to provide some depth. And in this case, you're asking your two big free agent signings to be key contributors as starters. Like these are guys that you want to be playing at a Pro Bowl level, which is a lot to ask. But I think when you look at the offseason in totality, this is a grade that we probably want to give after we've seen the draft and see how this came to fruition. I think we both are of the understanding that this probably gives a pretty big indication that we might go offensive tackle in the first round or offensive line, knowing that we still have a couple holes there. We didn't retain Cade Mays. He's a Detroit Lion now. And obviously, the deal he got was a little bit less than what I thought he would get on the open market, considering some of the other center contracts. But that is a still a need for this team. We have a need at left tackle as well, and you don't typically find a left tackle or at least a good one in free agency. So that is, I think, where the direction starts to turn. And if you're able to find a good one in the draft where you're supposed to build your team, then I think at that point you can start grading this offseason really well because you're able to find like people that filled needs and did it in a way that made sense. And that's what the past couple off seasons have built upon, have looked like. They make sense. It's just a matter of you hitting on the guys that you're evaluating and paying these big contracts. So I think on the outside looking at, well, we are at least Panthers fans, so we like to pretend we're on the inside. But this concept of looking in at what Dan Morgan and this team is building, I would probably lean towards a B grade, but again, I think it has to be incomplete until you see the entire offseason and the rest of the free agents that get brought in.
I think that's well said. I think what they had to do was get impact players on the defense, right, at those two positions. And like you mentioned, they did it with the offensive line 2 years ago. Last year, they did it with the defensive line. And now they're doing it here with edge rusher and linebacker. We wouldn't be in this position if we'll say from 2021 to 2023 the drafts hit, or 2020 to 2023 the drafts hit, but they didn't. So you kind of have to sign free agents to high deals. But looking at last year's draft in 2025, we got a lot of good production and early production from our players. So if that trend can continue, then we won't have to overpay in free agency, like you're saying. And that's why I think we're in agreement that offensive line in the first round of the draft in April would be a huge deal to hit on somebody like that. So you don't have to overpay at a position where you're already paying two guards high contract numbers, and Taylor Moton, your right tackle, is being paid a lot. I think that's why Cade Mays wasn't re-signed, because you can get a rookie, let's say like a fourth rounder's rookie contract for about 1 million a year compared to 8 million, and similar levels of play if that rookie has a good insulation around him. But I think that's a good point. We obviously lose Cade Mays to Detroit. Rico Dowdle, the running back who had a stellar season, was a big contributor to the early season turnaround. He cashed in with Pittsburgh, I believe. Right? Yeah, Pittsburgh. They
Yeah,
signed
I don't
him.
know what the deal was. I can look at that while we're discussing it. But that
I
like
think it
they
was
they
a
spent a lot of
two-year
money in
deal.
free agency.
Yeah, they traded for Michael Pittman, like we talked about, the receiver as well. Those are the two guys that Carolina quote unquote lost. And then besides that, and besides the people we've signed, it's been kind of stale or stagnant. There haven't been other re-signings or other Panthers players that have been um, signed elsewhere, right? You just wrote down in the notes that Rico got 12.25 million over 2 years, so similar to the 1 year deal that we gave him, just uh, over 2 years, right? So I think he cashed in there. That one's going to be interesting. I think the Caleb Johnson stocks there are kind of in the gutter for the Pittsburgh running back, but it'll be interesting to see if any other former Panthers get signed, like maybe some of the depth pieces. I don't know. who else would you still want, or what position would you still want to be addressed? Because I have a couple that I think the Panthers could still make moves for, but I'm largely satisfied with the needs for starters. There do need to be, we talked about the O line, and then there do need to be some depth pieces, I think, on defense.
So going back to the offensive tackle, I think this is a interesting point because the Rico Dowdle signing last year, I thought the whole purpose of the 1 year was to buy Jonathan Brooks time to get back from his second ACL tear. And so I think the goal is that the running back room looks like Chuba Hubbard, Jonathan Brooks, and Trevor Etienne. When you look at our tackle room, obviously Taylor Moton's getting a little bit older. And so I think drafting an offensive tackle makes sense because then you can move him to the right side and pay Ike Aquanu when it's time to pay him if he comes back fully healthy from his torn, it's patellar tendon, correct?
Yeah.
Um, so when you look at it that way, a guy that I see on the open market, and I thought he would be a prime candidate to go to the Chicago Bears on maybe a 1 or 2 year deal, was Taylor Decker. They just extended Braxton Jones. And so I think my concern there is okay, if he doesn't command a super high price tag and is willing to play on a 1 year deal along an offensive line that has a lot of good quality starters, is that a guy that you can get for a 1 year deal? And I think if you can, to buy you some time to get Ike Aquanu back fully healthy for the 2027 season, that is a guy that I think would be an interesting flyer. And I think if you can get that, then you don't pin yourself to taking an offensive tackle in the first round or feeling pressure that you have to. And with us cutting Ashawn Robinson, maybe that opens you up to taking a guy like Caleb Banks out of Florida. And if he can be your nose tackle next to Turk Wharton and Derek Brown, like I think that opens up their game as well. So I like that from the standpoint that I feel like it makes 19 in the first round feel like the best player available. And that I think it brings a lot of relief. There are some, I guess, indications that we might be interested in, like David Njoku or one of the tight ends on the open market. I wouldn't be so sure about going there. I would rather look at the free agency market. I know you brought up like drafting a center, like and late day two, maybe early day three. I'd be okay with also signing a guy like Lloyd Cushenberry, Ryan Kelly, Ethan Pochik, like those guys to another 1 2 year deal. Kind of just fill in the gaps so that you know you have competency at that position while you're developing a younger player. Because again, Cade Mays, he hit the open market, but he kind of came into his own after playing in the league a couple years. So it's one of those things that I do not want to force a rookie that maybe is not ready to start day one into a starting role and create issues along an offensive line that we've rebuilt over the past couple off seasons. I want to go into this season knowing that we have an answer at left tackle, we have an answer at center around the pieces that we've acquired or drafted over the past half decade or so.
I couldn't agree more. The O line has to be addressed. I wouldn't mind having rookies on the O line, but outside of the first round, excuse me, if you're forcing a rookie to start, it probably won't bode well, at least for the first couple games or the first handful of games as they adjust to the speed of the NFL. But O line aside, I think you can still add one or two more defensive backs. The safety room, I love Trayvon Merrick. I think he's a really good player. But I think Nick Scott, the other starting safety, I think he's still a free agent. Lathan Ransom came along toward the end of last year, but he's not super great in coverage. So another safety, nickel corner, I think could be addressed as well. Shaw Smith Wade, I think played decent, but he's a bit undersized. I know somebody I mentioned, Alante Taylor from the Saints. He was signed to a $20 million per year deal, which is just huge. I wasn't expecting that kind of deal, so I think the
I think
Panthers
they're
may
going to
need to
move
be
him.
frugal
I think
with
they're going to
that
move him to
position,
the
but
outside, though. I
maybe.
don't. I know he just played the slot, but like prior to that, he played 2/3 of his time on the outside. So again, I think with them handing out that kind of money, and it could just because the Titans and the Raiders have money to spend, that they just threw out that kind of contract. But I do think he'll go to the outside with that kind of money.
I would hope so. Otherwise, it's hard to spend $20 million on a corner that sits primarily in the slot. But hey, the Rams just did it after they traded for Kansas City's Trent McDuffie. But so that safety, like I said, and then tight end could use an upgrade, right? We still haven't had a premier receiving tight end. but it would be hard for me to sign somebody like David Njoku, right, who's getting up there in age to something more than 8 or 9 million, and then it'd be like a 1 year deal, and then you're in the same bucket again next year, right? So tight end would be something I would approach in the draft. I don't know. Receiver, maybe. But I'm kind of cool with Jalen Coker and T Mac being your 1-2 punch, and then like me, I always like adding a rookie receiver. So I think that's the direction I would go in to spend on one or two more defensive back pieces as well as the offensive line.
Yeah, and like you said, Shaw Smith Wade, he may not be the answer. I thought Corey Thornton, as a rookie last year, played pretty decently. So, like, you don't know if he
Hmm.
takes a step like Lathan Ransom on that back end. I don't know if you had mentioned kind of in that discussion, Nate Hobbs had just been released after his big extension with the Packers last offseason. So maybe he's a guy that ends up signing a 1 year prove it deal and would like to play alongside a guy like JC Horn and Mike Jackson, and that gives you some more flexibility on the back end as well. So we'll see kind of what the next few days, the next week or two looks like as we ramp up to the draft season. Because again, like if they end up signing a guy like Taylor Decker, then okay, it's probably BPA at 19. If they don't go and sign a guy like Taylor Decker, they're probably looking at taking offensive linemen and have kind of cued in on who they're going to take there. And then on day two, day three, like you're saying, like that's where it's like you add another wide receiver, you add a center, you add some of these pieces where it's like you're going to develop a guy behind your starters, and hopefully they're a key contributor early and often. But the goal is that you develop them to where they're able to replace some of the guys that are due for contracts or become free agents later on. So that, like for instance, like when we're talking about Rico Dowdle hitting free agency, I don't think that hurts our team that much, especially if Jonathan Brooks is able to come back healthy. And I think that's the whole point of this. So we discussed Alante Taylor making $20 million per year. Kind of alluded to Tyler Linderbaum resetting the center market. Were there any other like implicative signings across the league that kind of changed the landscape, so to speak? And if so, like what were those signings for you, Jacob?
Going back to the start, Alec Pierce's 29 million, which is huge to me. This is like he's never had 50 catches in a season. I understand that he had an impressive season last year, but it's hard for me to believe that he can sustain the high yards per catch, I think, on an increased volume, especially when we don't know who the QB is, right? Daniel Jones probably won't start the season. Kyler Murray's status is still in the air. If I were Kyler Murray, I would go to Minnesota because there's much better infrastructure there. So you don't know who's throwing the ball. You trade away a pretty key receiver in Michael Pittman, so more experienced defensive backs are going to focus on Alec Pierce. That deal was just a crazy one to me, and it trickled down. Right, Romeo Dubs, the Packers probably third best receiver, signed for close to 20 million a year. Like, he can get there with incentives with the Patriots today. Wandale Robinson, who was on the Giants, signed with the Titans for a little over 17 million a year, and he's the opposite of Alec Pierce. He had like 100 catches this year, but only for 1,000 yards, and he's I think 5'7" or 5'6". He's like the inverse Pierce, but they had the same amount of yards this season. So just a significant receiver deal like that trickling down, I think disrupted the market. The last thing I'll say on Pierce, his deal is worth more than what T. Higgins signed last year with the Cincinnati Bengals. And I don't know about you, I think Higgins is multiple tiers above Pierce as a player. So like that's kind of my thought process on it.
Yeah, the wide receiver market has definitely increased. I think and obviously T. Higgins is a bigger bodied receiver, but I feel like there's been a bigger market. Like Mike Evans, I think he got like a deal that was like close to the $20 million with his age and injury history. Like that was kind of crazy considering him going to San
With the
Francisco.
49ers, right? Like that's the
Yeah, that
old and injured
substation.
team.
Yeah, well, it's like the injury histories of like all the players there. George Kittle is probably not going to play this entire year. Brandon Ayuk is probably not going to play for you. Ricky Purcell has his injury history. Christian McCaffrey, like it's just, I it's they're only a couple injuries away from, and like Trent Williams, he may not be back. So it's like the 49ers are in this weird limbo state where things could go wrong very quickly in 2026. But you go to Wandale Robinson, his contract with the Tennessee Titans, Romeo Dobbs just signing with the New England Patriots. They do have a feeling of being inflated. And I think what kind of like messes or skews this up is that the salary cap keeps increasing at a pretty like I wouldn't say astronomical rate, but it's a pretty high rate to which it makes some of these deals look a little bit like more inflated than they probably are because like what we talked about, Brian Burns when he signed, I think it was a little over $28 million, but had he signed it now it'd be 33 million. But again, when we're talking about just like the strict like value of the contract, Jalen Phillips is technically making more than Brian Burns. And so it's just you have to take some of this with a grain of salt and look at the inflated numbers so that it's not like a rose colored tint to it and going, oh, well, we could have had this player for a lot cheaper. It's like, with the current numbers and how the salary cap is going to continue to grow, it's hard to like look at it through that perspective. But yes, to your point, Alec Pierce, T. Higgins, I think has definitely proven himself more. The issue is when you look at that contract and the details for Pierce, they might have been released earlier today, but T. Higgins was really a 2 year contract. The Bengals could have gotten out of that if they wanted to. The guys that they can't get out of are Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. And I'm feeling like, especially with how they just offloaded their older receiver to the Pittsburgh Steelers and Michael Pittman, that Alec Pierce's deal may really be like more of a 2 year deal. And if they don't like it, they're able to offload it or just simply cut them to save money in the future. So again, I a lot of these bigger numbers come out. You see some of the guaranteed numbers, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. But a lot of times these teams kind of put some stop gaps in the contract to get out of it after a year or two, because again, the GMs can really only plan for a 2 year window because one, you don't know about your own job security, and two, your roster changes almost 50% within that window. So a lot goes into this, but yes, to your point, the wide receiver market has changed, I think, drastically. And we'll see if that continues to be a trend with how it's addressed in the draft, and if there are any big names like a AJ Brown or Brian Thomas that are moved in a trade leading up to the draft.
Yeah, I think you put it in a good perspective with the inflated value. One contract you can't say that about, however, is Tyler Linderbaum, the center. The Ravens center, he's now a Las Vegas Raider. Jason Fitzgerald at Over the Cap, like the main salary cap NFL website or format, he brought up how when you compare Linderbaum's contract, which was $27 million a year for a center, by far the highest ever. When you look at the next highest inflated contract, it finished at about 22 million, and I think that was Frank Ragnow, almost half a decade ago. So when you take a what would that percentage jump be? 20% jump from one player to the next, in terms of inflation, not even in terms of raw value, where I think the next highest was Creed Humphrey at 18, which would be a
Mm-hmm.
50%, or I guess 150% jump in terms of contract value. That's just a really insane one to me. When you look around the league, right? The Bears traded for a center right before free agency started, so you got the feeling that maybe they were out of the running. I thought that, oh, okay, Linderbaum might be asking for 20 million, but no, it was 27 million. That seems like, and I know good players are good players, but 27 million for a center is like, that's like good tackle money, you know. We're 27 million for a center would be, or 27 million in general, I think is the third highest contract handed out in free agency this year, right? Behind
Mm-hmm.
Phillips, an edge rusher, and Pierce, a wide, presumably a wide receiver one for the Colts this year. I know Linderbaum's good. He was the first year that I ever did draft stuff. He was one of my first round guys, so I'm a Linderbaum fan. But for me, I can't fathom giving 27 million to a center, and then by just by association, that makes a lot of the other center contracts that were signed look much better, right? Like the Bills re-signed their guy for 13 million, and I was kind of joking with one of my Bills buddies beforehand. I was like, "That's the fourth highest for a center. That's not super great." And then the Raiders go and double it plus more for the next guy. So I don't know. That one just kind of, it didn't shake me or anything, but it was very, very unexpected that they would give that much for a center.
And it's interesting because the reason why the Baltimore Ravens didn't tag Tyler Linderbaum is because it's based on the entire offensive line market, and so a tag would have looked very similar to what he got paid. I think of the Raiders' defense is they obviously had cash in their pocket to burn. And when you look at it, it was a 3-year deal. So he's, I think, just about to turn 26. When he's due for his next contract, he's going to be like 28 years old. So I'm not saying that Tyler Linderbaum's the Kirk Cousin of centers, but like he is setting himself up very nicely to continue making a lot of money throughout his career going into that third contract as long as he performs well. I think Sam Schwarstein with the Athletic when he came on and they were doing live reactions yesterday, I he kind of hit the head on the nail. And it was okay, like if Tyler Linderbaum were to go to a team like the Cincinnati Bengals, where you're trying to take off a lot of the plate of what Joe Burrow's doing at the line, and he's not having to set the protection. Like Tyler Linderbaum is setting the protection that allows him to focus on okay, making the right play call and seeing what coverage the defense is in to know where he's going to attack kind of the field. I, doesn't really make a lot of sense in Clint Kubiak's offense. Like, yes, he is one of the better from like college film, like outside zone run blockers and his ability to pull, get to the second level. Like, it's very obvious on film from a run blocking standpoint. But this team is more than likely going to call play action on like 30% of their plays. Like, this is an offense that is not necessarily asking a lot of its center in terms of setting protections and does a lot schematically to protect themselves from like offensive line play. So it's just like, why, when you could use that money and those resources elsewhere, are you spending so much on one player? And if it is just to make sure that that exchange between center and your first overall quarterback is solid, there's no issues there, then fine, so be it. But there's no other way to put it than they paid a massive premium to bring this guy into the building.
I think you brought up the point right there that they want to help Fernando Mendoza, who's we can assume is going to be the number one pick going to Las Vegas. One of Mendoza's struggles, and he didn't have many this past season, but when he faced pressure, he was just a terrible quarterback, and you saw it in the playoff run. He didn't really deal with any major struggles throughout the season. Ohio State and Iowa gave him a little bit of trouble in those games. That's where they were a little bit closer in the regular season. But then in the playoff, Alabama only pressured him on the first drive, and it was a 3-and-out. And then after that, they didn't face any pressure because their O line was very good. They just steamrolled Alabama. Same thing with Texas Tech. And eventually, when they faced Miami, that game was a much different story, right? That was a one-score game. Miami could have, probably should have gone down and won it, but Carson Beck just threw to a spot without looking where defenders were. And throughout that game, you saw the two Miami edge rushers, both of whom will probably hear their names called on the first night of the draft, just have their way with the offensive line and really create struggles for Mendoza. Those were pressures from the edge, and that was the tackle's fault. But if they want to have a seamless exchange, so to speak, because I think Linderbaum is the best center in the league, that could have been another reason why they are willing to pay that premium, like you alluded to.
Yeah, and having that security is nice, but again, like you got to look at the offensive line just like the secondary is a weak link system. So it's like, could you have gotten a good veteran like where we just talked about a couple guys that hit the open market? I obviously some have already been scooped up, but you could have gotten a guy like Cade Mays, or you could get a guy like Lloyd Cushenberry or Ryan Kelly that the fill in for a
Or
year or two.
could you have gotten Linderbaum for 24 million? You know,
But yeah,
it's such a
potentially.
stark jump from 18 to 27 that I, I don't want to say it's unnecessary because I'm sure that the Ravens were probably offering 23 million to keep Linderbaum. But that's such a stark jump to where you're right. Now you are going to be having to eschew 27 million a year just to your center when if your rookie QB hits, you want to build a team around him, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And I think with that, like that's a good kind of wrap up point of just like these signings that have caused like a domino effect around the league to where I think we can have some takes now. And I want to circle back and I I know I've talked about I obviously last week that I did not think that we are going to take the tight end out of Oregon. At 19. I'm trying to remember the episode before. I didn't say anything about like a position we would take in the draft, correct?
I don't think so.
Okay. I wanted to make sure I didn't think I was crazy in assuming this, but I think the position we take at 19, if we stay there, is a tackle. It is either going to be an offensive tackle or a defensive tackle. And so if we sign a Taylor Decker, I think Peter Woods and Caleb Banks become kind of the go-to players and helps kind of create depth and a rotation along the defensive line. And I think if we don't address offensive tackle in free agency, that is going to be a position of need and something we look for in the first round. Whether or not our guy falls to us or we've reached a little bit for the position, I do think that is the direction. So I think we take a tackle at pick 19 coming up here in a couple months. Well, a month and a half now.
Yeah, less than 50 days. What would that be? 21 plus 23. So we're at no 21 plus 22. We're at 43 days, excuse me, away from the draft. It is approaching. It's like Christmas. The countdown has begun. I like that a lot. We talked about how, or I continually talk about sometimes on Twitter, sometimes just with you or with friends, that I think like the trenches are where you win games. And I know the Panthers have taken uh, receiver, quarterback in three consecutive first rounds. But before that, it was a tackle. And then obviously you have a corner, but then you have a defensive tackle, an edge rusher. You got to reinforce the trenches. And we saw it with the Super Bowl this year, right? The Seahawks overwhelmed Drake May's offensive line and just forced him into so many mistakes. And the Patriots paid Milton Williams and got to the Super Bowl largely because of it. And so I'm gonna stay with this theme. I think we're gonna sign at least two more offensive line free agents, whether it's bringing back some of our own people, like Josh Nyman to be our swing tackle or Brady Christensen, or if it's bringing in somebody like you mentioned, Taylor Decker to be a 1 year stopgap until Ekwonu was healthier, a center like Ryan Kelly or Ethan Pocic or somebody who's experienced. I think the Panthers are going to sign at least two more offensive linemen, maybe not to premiums, but to reinforce the idea that we talked about. You don't want to have a rookie being forced to start unless absolutely necessary. So I think that they're going to add two more just for depth, maybe a starter, but that's my take. We're going to see at least two more. Now that the first wave is kind of winding down, you'll see a couple more here in the next couple weeks.
Okay, I like it. We need that depth, like we talked about. Even if we address that kind of some of those positions in the draft, we need some more depth. And I like it. I like that take, and I definitely think that is a direction Dan Morgan and this front office will take.
For sure. I think that is everything. We will be back at some point before the draft to discuss. Probably do two episodes, right? Offense and defense, and then probably a mock draft. So three, maybe four episodes up until draft night, which is April 23rd is night one. So over the coming weeks, we will be back. But until then, you can follow the Panthers' state of free agency, like see who we're signing on Twitter. We're also on Twitter. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your content. And until we are back, keep pounding.